Hello, it's Sarah-Jane Mee on the Sky News Daily today. Now, the BBC produced hundreds of hours of Glastonbury coverage at the weekend, but now attention is just on a few seconds of it. As the Tories have suggested, could the BBC have this weekend committed a crime by broadcasting a band which it says was antisemitic? The BBC was careful not to put the controversial band Kneecap live onto the iPlayer at this year's Glastonbury. That was after one of its members had been charged with a terrorism offence. But it did broadcast the pro-Palestinian rappers Bob Vylan live, a duo already known for being fiercely political and provocative. During the set, they had this to say.
We're seeing the UK and the US be complicit in war crimes and genocide happening over there to the Palestinian people. Sometimes you've got to get your message across with violence because that is the only language that some people speak, unfortunately.
But the big problem for the BBC is that the pictures and audio stayed on air when Bob Vylan then led chants of death to the IDF, the Israeli Defence Forces. Glastonbury says those words do not represent the festival's values. The band has since been dropped by their agents. The BBC admits it should have pulled the footage. The police are now investigating if there was a hate crime on stage. The Tories think the BBC might have committed a crime itself. On this episode, what should the broadcaster have done differently? And does the law apply as the Tories have suggested? The lawyer Joshua Rozenberg will be on with us shortly, but first, former head of news at Channel 4, Dorothy Byrne. Dorothy, were the clues all there for the BBC about this particular act? They took to the stage just before Kneecap, and we're all well aware that people have been on high alert for that particular group. Bob Vylan came out on stage just before. Were the BBC taking the right measures, or were they too focused on one particular band and not applying all of this to all of the acts at Glastonbury?
I mean, you said it yourself, the clues were all there. A cursory look online tells you that this man has said that he likes upsetting people. He had made radical statements about Israel, which is his right in a free country, but that should have warned them that he was quite likely to say something very radical. And therefore, I would not have streamed him live, just as they didn't stream Kneecap live. And the impression one gets is that Glastonbury was looked after by teams who knew about music when they needed somebody who understood politics, because anybody who understood politics would have looked through that programme and done a bit of due diligence about all the acts to see which ones should not be screened live. And then once they had started streaming him live, the moment that he called for people to be killed, and it doesn't matter who they are, that's wrong, they should have pulled that feed and just gone to another feed. You work at Sky, I worked at Channel 4 and ITV. We do that the whole time. And then their third big mistake was when they made the other mistakes, they didn't apologise for it for hours and hours and hours. They kept saying that they had put a warning up on the screen about potential discriminatory language. Well, you can't just warn people about discriminatory language. You cannot have unchallenged discriminatory language on a television service.
How difficult do you think it is for the BBC to decide where the line should be in terms of what is said at an event that isn't run by them? They live stream Glastonbury. They have done for years. Should it have been clearer in this case? Because, you know, we can debate free speech all day long. But do you think the BBC should have clearer lines?
In this case, it wasn't difficult. ironically, last week, Tim Davies, the Director General of the BBC, put out a statement to all staff saying that no hate speech should be broadcast. This was hate speech. Had nobody read what Tim Davies said? But again and again with Gaza, the BBC keeps making basic mistakes. So it made what was in other ways a wonderful film about children in Gaza, which I admired very much. But one of the children was the son of a Hamas official. No, he was only a water authority official, but he was a Hamas official. So politically, he should not have been in that film, but he was allowed to narrate the whole film. And the BBC said that they had asked the programme makers, does any child in this film have a connection with Hamas? And they didn't receive an answer. Well, if they didn't receive an answer, they shouldn't have put the film out. And then we've also seen in the past couple of weeks, the BBC refused to put out a film about doctors in Gaza, which they commissioned themselves. So the filmmakers have taken it to Channel 4, and Channel 4 is putting out. Channel 4 is overseen and bound by the same regulators as the BBC. So what we seem to have here is that the BBC put out things they shouldn't put out, and then arguably don't put out things they should put out.
As you said, the BBC have come under heavy criticism for its coverage of Gaza and the ongoing conflict in the Middle East. It doesn't seem to make the same decision twice. Why can't they get to the right place on their Middle East coverage?
If you look at BBC News coverage, I think it's very good indeed. And I don't agree at all with those who say it's anti-Semitic. I mean, they bend over backwards to be duly impartial. At times, it's almost painful the way they feel they have to keep repeating things to be duly impartial. Now, I haven't worked at the BBC, but it's often struck me that when things go wrong there, which they seem to do a lot, frankly, over Hugh Edwards or Jimmy Savile or Gaza, the line of command is not clear. It seems that there are several different people who are responsible, whereas when you're in a leaner organisation like Sky or Channel 4, you've got a much simpler line of command because you've got fewer people. And I think it's a case of where fewer people can be a lot better.
The BBC has apologised and said that the language is unacceptable. That performance by that group no longer available on its iPlayer services. What do you think the end point of this is? Is an apology enough? A resignation? What happens next on this?
The first thing that will happen is that the regulator will hold an investigation. The BBC can hold its own investigation. And may I say that's one of the other things about the BBC. They have these investigations. They seem to go on forever. And we often never hear what the result is. So I'm not interested in BBC investigations. The police are investigating. Was there potentially an unlawful act here? That is a different issue. But this was about the most basic procedural errors. So I hope the BBC won't launch a big inquiry into what new procedures it should have. You know what they need is they need a bit of common sense.
What would you have done if you were in the hot seat right now? Dorothy is a former ex-head of news and current affairs. What would you be putting into action today?
Well, I would be doing an immediate inquiry as to what went wrong, definitely. I would have put out an apology much more quickly. When you think that all morning, or most of the morning, the BBC was still trying to say that they had put on the screen a warning that there was discriminatory language, that was the most ridiculous statement. I would also make whoever was responsible come out and do interviews. I mean, here's the BBC, a news broadcaster. I've listened to several of their news broadcasts today. I have not seen a named person take any responsibility. I think it should be a very senior person. We need to see Samir Shah or Tim Davies come out and hold themselves accountable instead of these mealy-mouthed statements from anonymous sources.
Thank you, Dorothy Byrne. So the BBC could and should have done things differently and are now reviewing their live events guidance. But that might not be the end of this. Could the BBC now face legal action? Here's legal expert Joshua Rozenberg. Joshua, what we saw, there were so many different parts in this, so many players involved, if you like. The BBC, Glastonbury itself, the festival, who gave the band the platform. The act, of course, and the crowd as well. The crowd chanting along, chanting back, involved in those chants. And as you made reference to, they're sharing videos on social media of that performance if they were there. Can we start first by talking about the act? Even in Somerset Police, that the video evidence is going to be assessed by officers. That's been confirmed by the head of the Metropolitan Police today to determine whether any offences may have been committed that would require a criminal investigation. We're talking about a hate crime here. What would the police be looking at to determine if a hate crime was committed?
They will be looking at Section 18 of the Public Order Act, and that says that a person who uses threatening, abusive or insulting words or behaviour or displays any written material which is threatening, abusive or insulting is guilty of an offence if he intends thereby to stir up racial hatred or, having regard to the circumstances, racial hatred is likely to be stirred up thereby. So this is an offence aimed at an individual. In this case, Pascal Robinson Foster is the person presumably under investigation. He's the person accused of making these remarks that are said to have broken the law. So that's the first stage. But as you say, then there is the question of whether the broadcaster, the BBC, was also likely to have stirred up racial hatred by broadcasting this and by not pulling the plug. And you mentioned the crowd, and that's a significant thing because as I see it, you've got to look at the performance as a whole. You've got to look at the way in which the crowd reacted. You've got to look at the way in which the performers egged on the crowd, responded to the crowd, spoke to the crowd. And you've got to decide on the basis of that whether it was likely that racial hatred was stirred up, whether it was expected that racial hatred would be stirred up. So those are quite difficult tests. You've got to look at the evidence, you've got to look at the law, you've got to look at past cases. But certainly, I think there is something for the police to get their teeth into, and I'm sure they'll seek advice from the Crown Prosecution Service on this.
What about the festival organisers, Glastonbury? Because obviously they invited this act to perform at their festival. They were very quick in putting out a statement afterwards saying that a line had clearly been crossed and that they were appalled by the statements made on stage at their festival. Is there any likelihood of Glastonbury facing a backlash?
It's certainly a backlash, yes, because I think everybody thinks that this was a mistake. But if you look at the Public Order Act generally and the section dealing with racial hatred, there's also a section dealing with a public performance of a play. Now, this isn't a play in the sense of a piece of drama, but nevertheless, the aim of the Public Order Act is to criminalise everybody involved in something that stirs up racial hatred. I don't think necessarily the organisers would be prosecuted, but if you look at the broadcasting offence, there is a very specific broadcasting offence which says that even if the broadcaster, in this case the BBC, is convicted, obviously you can't send a corporation to prison, so the maximum would be an unlimited fine. But there's also a provision in the Act which says that the people who are responsible, somebody such as an editor, consented to the broadcast going ahead or connived at it, then they could be personally liable as well. And that brings us back to what Ofcom are looking at. They will want to know whether the BBC had enough editorial controls there, whether there was somebody of sufficient seniority to say, this is not acceptable, we must switch to another act, and why that didn't happen.
The band itself saying that they want to court controversy, we know that. The band has been very open about that before they went into this performance, and in a statement they've put that they want to see a change in foreign policy. Can I just ask you a question about something else that Chris Philp, the Shadow Home Secretary, said before our time together comes to an end? He referenced the parallels between what happened with this band at Glastonbury in the case of Lucy Connolly, which people listening may remember. Lucy Connolly jailed for 31 months last year after calling for hotels housing asylum seekers to be set on fire after the Southport attacks. Is what's happened here similar?
I think it is similar. She was convicted under Section 19 of the Public Order Act, which says that a person who publishes or distributes written material which is threatening, abusive or insulting is guilty of an offence if she intends to stir up racial hatred or, having regard to the circumstances, racial hatred is likely to be stirred up. So very similar wording to the allegations against this performer and indeed against the BBC. And indeed the penalty is the same, maximum of 7 years imprisonment, and it's prosecuted in the same way. So it is similar. The significance about Lucy Connolly, of course, is that she pleaded guilty to this offence. She admitted that what she had done broke the Public Order Act and was sentenced accordingly and is due out of prison, I think, in the next couple of months. But it is similar, and there is a perfectly reasonable argument that if we come down hard on people who stir up racial hatred in this way, as she admitted that she has done, then if the allegations are proved that we're talking about now, the courts should equally deal with the people who are accused of stirring up racial hatred at Glastonbury over the weekend.
Joshua Rozenberg, thank you. In its statement on Monday, the BBC said it stands firmly against incitement to violence. It said the anti-Semitic sentiments from Bob Vylan were utterly unacceptable and had no place on its airwaves, and added that it is looking at its guidance for live events in the future. Emily Eavis and the Glastonbury Festival had already said it was appalled by the statements made and believed that the band had crossed a line. Well, that's it for today's Sky News Daily. We'll be back again tomorrow.